Welcome everybody. Our speakers here at the table in the Bali, our speakers at home, Florian and Cheng Chui in Malaysia, who's probably already asleep, I'm not quite sure. And then of course the authors of the book who are not able to be here but are watching from home. And finally, but not the most unimportantly, all the audience looking from their screens to this session, either on their kitchen table or at their desk. We're very happy to have you. It's the first of our public sessions in 2021. It will probably not be the last one online, although we have hopes that in the course of 2021, and in spite of the pace of the Dutch vaccination program, we will be able gradually to meet you here in the Bali or elsewhere live. And we're all looking very much forward to that. Okay, this session is because a book came out today that we feel that you should read. It was a book compiled by 13 authors in 13 chapters dealing with the Belt Road Initiative, which is a phenomenon that most of you have heard of before. What makes this book a little bit different is that it goes from a global comparative perspective, taking into account general topics like tax and trade, cooperation in the field of higher education, but also looking at several regions across 3 continents. That is the book which I will show you here. Florian Schneider, the director of the LeidenAsiaCentre, who edited, will say a few more things about the ideas behind the book. The session of this afternoon, however, is not really on the content of the book. The book is available through open access, so it will not cost you a penny. Those of you who have saved a lot of money because so many things were cancelled could really contemplate to give themselves a treat by buying the book. It's 125 euros, but it's worthwhile. But for everybody else, there is a link visible in the chat function of this meeting where you can, through open access, have the book for free. And that is our gift to you. We will have 4 of the authors commenting on the chapter and the developments in the various countries since the book was finished in August last year. And in addition to that, we have a pre-recorded interview from our colleague Cheng Chui Quick from Malaysia, Kuala Lumpur, and we have Florian Schneider, who will say a few things about why the book was written. And then in the very end, after the discussions here, we hope that you will join us in the Q&A session and that you will have questions to either Florian Schneider or the 4 authors present here, or about the book in general. The book is 350 pages. That is what you get when you ask 13 academicians to do field work and good research. It's worthwhile reading, and Florian Schneider will now explain to you why. Florian.
Yes, thank you, Lily, and welcome everyone at Bali and online. Thank you for joining us for our launch of this book. I want to give you a little bit of context about the Belt and Road Initiative and then say a few things about what drove us to create this project. And I'm going to conclude by telling you what our core findings were before we release you into the exciting discussion with our presenters today and our discussions today. So for those of you who are not entirely familiar with the Belt and Road Initiative, it's of course a large-scale project that covers infrastructure issues, but also so much more. In terms of its scope, we're talking about something in the vicinity of 1 trillion to possibly 8 trillion US dollars that the Chinese government is planning to spend by the end of the course of this project, which will come to its conclusion in 2049. So on the eve of the 100-year anniversary of the People's Republic of China. And what is happening there is of huge relevance domestically in China because of the way that it fuels economic growth and potentially legitimates the authorities. It is of huge significance internationally as a set of strategies and tools for the Chinese authorities to shape the environment in which China finds itself in the 21st century, and is of course also of relevance to everyone else, pretty much everywhere at this point, because of the way that the Belt and Road Initiative projects are revamping physical and digital infrastructures around the world, the way they are recalibrating production chains, whether they're already existing production chains or potentially creating new ones, and the way in which they are contributing to shifts in standards and conventions, whether it's in policy, in economics, or in the way that people use technology. So the Belt and Road Initiative is going to be at the heart of international affairs for decades to come. And that is the relevance of this project. But what made us choose the particular path for this book is that we felt there is increasingly an approach to the Belt and Road Initiative which is taking the complexities into account. The earlier work on this was a bit hyperbolic at times, and we wanted to contribute to these newer discussions and show how incredibly complicated and complex these interactions actually are and try to tease them apart. Now, this is important, not just because academics like nuance and complexity, we do, but we also want to demonstrate to you why this complexity actually matters if you want to understand the Belt and Road Initiative. And just to give you two brief examples of why digging into the details is so important. One is that it's common to talk about the Belt and Road Initiative as having at its core China as the major actor. And that's elegant, that's simple, but it's also a bit misleading because there's no single China that acts. There's so many different ministries and organizations, various kinds of diplomats that are engaged, state-owned enterprises, private organizations, private enterprises, and they don't necessarily all have the same agenda. So to assume that there's one big master plan might be oversimplifying the situation somewhat. And similarly to the situation in China, wherever the Belt and Road then takes shape in various contexts, there are numerous partners in those locations that also have sometimes conflicting interests, sometimes similar interests, but not necessarily in a way that the Chinese government anticipates. So it becomes a very complicated process. And if we miss the opportunity to assess these processes, then we might just miss how the decision-making processes work and what motivates them, which becomes a problem for scholars, but it also becomes a problem for practitioners who might just be involved in these processes. So let me just say tell you what our four core findings from this book actually are. So one is indeed that local actors matter a great deal and how the Belt and Road Initiative becomes implemented. It matters what the stakeholders in various target countries are doing. It is not just, they're not just passive actors or audiences that just receive BRI funding and that is the end of the story. They often recruit that funding. And that's then also essentially the second finding already, that all of this is a pluralist endeavor. You frequently see actors, whether it's in Indonesia or in various African contexts that we have studied or elsewhere, who also have to contend with domestic audiences, with other elites, and justify these various projects, and they use them for their own particularist purposes. So in that sense, the BRI is pluralist. And then the third finding is, and I'm borrowing from one of our colleagues who is also represented in this book, and that's Ruben Gonzalez Vicente, who said that it's essentially old wine in new bottles. And that means that many of the BRI initiatives, they're not all that novel. They are building on, or they are emulating the practices we are already familiar with from the way that the WTO works or the World Bank works. And they are essentially filling gaps or trying to find vacuums within previously existing activities or activities where other actors have retreated, and then expanding in a quite similar vein. So it's not all as novel and new as it might seem at first sight. And the final finding is that the geographical context matters a great deal in how people make sense of the BRI and how they make decisions. And by that I mean that all these various actors, they're constantly reinventing and reinterpreting what political, economic, and social space should actually look like. That has effects on how people talk about economic corridors, how they think about sea lanes, how they position themselves strategically and geostrategically and geoeconomically. But it also has to do with how various actors conceptualize themselves. And for instance, think of their place in the world not as located as, for instance, the Middle East, but turning that around and turning it into Western Asia in order to make new arguments about how certain actors should be at the crossroads of these networks. And that, I think, is something that also our contributors, Mamat Farrow and Zanne van der Lucht, can say more about as we go into the discussion, because they've both worked on this as well. So I hope this gives you a good impression of the core arguments of this book and how it is structured. I'm really looking forward to the discussion, and yeah, I hope you do too. So back to the Bali in Amsterdam.
Thank you very much for bringing us up to date of the main findings of the book. We're going to share that view with the four authors around the table here. And it is good of you to have pointed out on the diversity of agents within China who deal with the Belt and Road Initiative. And we will see that that same diversity is also mirrored in the countries on the recipient end of this Chinese lending and investment program. I start with two regions that are not very often included in the Belt Road Initiative overview because they're outside Asia. Of course, the Belt Road is a global initiative for sure, but there are two regions, I think one specifically the Middle East or West Asia, if we could call it that way, but also Africa. Now, there is a lot of attention for Africa and China these days because there is a Dutch very popular series at the television right now with Ruben Terlouw, who has been in Africa, and I think it's a good illustration of what both Sanne van der Lucht, who is here, she's a researcher at Klingendaal and also at LeidenAsiaCentre, and her colleague Stacey Links, whom we had before in June at Newsport. The two of them have looked at Africa, and you in particular have looked at Ethiopia, and in specifically the digital Silk Road, which is not which is not hard infrastructure. Well, to a certain extent it is, but it's very important and a very influential tool within the BRI that you see in Africa and also other countries. Sanne, when listening to Florian and also looking at the three main topics that Cheng Chui is identifying in his presentation later, how do you feel that the issue of agency is proving itself to be true when you look at Ethiopia? Ethiopia is a small state, very important recipient, but nevertheless a small state. How can Ethiopia have an impact on this global grand strategy of China?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, when looking at the digital infrastructure in Ethiopia, the agency of the Ethiopian government becomes very clear out of the fact that they use multiple foreign actors in almost all digital domains. Yes, it's true, they started with only the Chinese company ZTE for their telecom infrastructure, but when they realized that there was quite a bit of critique about not good services, that the internet was not working that well, they decided to introduce two of the main competitors of ZTE, Huawei and Ericsson, into the market as well. And a similar thing you can see in satellites. Ethiopia launched its first satellite in December 2019. That was in cooperation with China. But China is not the only cooperation partner in building satellites, because they also have a project together with France, for example. So that's where you can see the agency. They make sure that they do not become too dependent on one supplier.
I mean, have they learned that lesson from the very beginning, that becoming too dependent restricts your agency, the way that you can negotiate stuff?
Yeah, maybe the negotiation position, but also that you need competition in order to get the best out of a company.
Okay. Not only the cost, but also the effectiveness. Yep. Okay, yep. Okay, that's good. What are the stakeholders in Ethiopia if it comes to deciding on, will we go with the Chinese, or how will we start negotiating? Is there a public debate, for instance, in Ethiopia on the role of China currently?
That's not what I've been seeing in Ethiopia. It's quite clearly the state deciding on whether to cooperate with China or France or both. That also has to do with the way opposition is treated in Ethiopia. So people might have other opinions about it, but you would not see that so much in a public debate. There it's a little bit... It's unfortunate that because of COVID, I wasn't able to get into the country, because I'm sure if I would have dinners, lunches with people, I would get more of a feeling of what kind of discussions are going on behind the scene. But what I can say is that there are also other actors, and then that are mostly entrepreneurs. So you can see other local digital companies who are also filling in the gaps that are there. So in that way, how to say that they offer an alternative to working together with the Chinese if they offer the solution at home.
I see. And the French stepped in. Are they the only Europeans who have tried to counter this Chinese investment wave?
No, so Swedish Ericsson is there as well.
Yeah.
Were there also before ZTE. And the French are there with EU funding. So there's also the larger EU behind it. And then there are also companies that are just there for business, and there's not necessarily a government institution behind it. Because we also often think of that Ethiopia would choose deliberately to work with China, with Chinese technology, because of using it as a surveillance tool to control its own citizens, and then especially opposition parties. But it's interesting to see that in a Human Rights Watch report, they found that the Chinese do not only make use, the Ethiopians do not only make use of Chinese technology, but there's also this German company, Finfisher, or an Italian company, hacking team. So the Ethiopian government is making use of different kind of companies, and is definitely not only relying on Chinese technology, but it's not always that there's a political agenda behind it. It's also just companies who see interesting opportunities, because Ethiopia is the second largest economy of the African continent, and also the second largest populous country. So it offers huge possibilities for all kinds of companies.
It is a very important market.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, good. Now, there was an article in the Financial Times in December that the Chinese investment through the Belt Road Initiative are really surging. Compared to 2016, 75 billion was being landed, invested, etc. It fall back to 4 billion. Yeah. Is that a pattern that you see in Ethiopia or in Africa, if I may ask you that question more in general?
Yes, because it is in general, the Chinese government wanted to have more control over foreign spending. So yes,
that's a general trend.
It's a general trend, I guess. Yeah.
Okay. Good. Thank you for now. We might come back to you, but now I turn to Mamad, who is a lecturer at Leiden University, Middle Eastern Studies, and also a fellow of the LeidenAsiaCentre. You're a fellow, I guess. Yeah, you're a fellow with us, and you're a fellow. Okay, good. Mamad, you're originally you're from Iran. And Iran turned out to be a very interesting very interesting country if you look at the BRI. Because in Iran there is, or has been, fierce competition between China and India on all kind of grand infrastructure projects in Iran. Also, if I may say so, in Iran the political process is less transparent than in many other countries. So it's very difficult to see how local elites are preferring either China or India, well, simply said. What is the situation now? How is China doing in terms of real investment and real development of infrastructure, as for instance compared to the Indian ambition to get a foothold in Iran?
So yeah, the story, first of all, thank you for inviting me.
Thank you for being here.
And the story of Iran, I think, should be understood in the larger picture of global politics, because Iran is connected to the story of how American politics unfolds, how Chinese politics and geoeconomics unfolds. So after the nuclear deal with the Obama administration, the Trump administration came in and unraveled the deal. That had huge advantages for Chinese companies. For instance, Total, the French company that had 50% of the largest share of gas reserves in South Pars fields that Iran shares with Qatar, had to leave, so 50%. And then the Chinese companies took over. Maersk, the Danish shipping company, had to leave. Some Chinese companies came in. Ericsson had to leave for the digital Silk Road that Sana was talking about. Huawei came in. So in many ways, the story of Iran is a big boon for Chinese companies. The story of Iran versus Trump is still very profitable for the Chinese companies. But when it comes to the Iran question and the bigger question of the BRI, Iran finds itself basically, or at least wants to portray itself as the crossroads between different economies, different continents or regions. That's why in this chapter I focused on the idea of Iran as a civilizational and economic crossroads. Because in my field work in recent years in Iran, I noticed that this is a theme that comes up all the time. When you talk to politicians, when you talk to business people, when you talk to academics, the idea of Iran as a crossroads comes up all the time, and the idea of the greater Iran, which is the historical Persian Empire, parts of that empire also are implicated. What is today, for instance, Afghanistan or Iraq or Central Asia. So the Iranian leader has been talking about the idea of basically increasing diplomacy and economic interaction between different parts of the greater Iran, with all the imperial resonances that has. And more specifically in this chapter, I focus on the Iranian geographic agency in the sense of Iran actively trying to give itself a geographic identity as a civilizational and economic crossroads, especially in terms of culture and economy, economically between China and the West, Western Europe especially, so the two largest economies or economic zones, and culturally in terms of the idea of greater Iran. And then there are multiple actors involved, which I can get into if you so wish,
yes,
but since I'm not
we
sure.
Wish. On behalf of the audience, I think we wish. Yes.
Iran is working on multiple levels in terms of redefining its geographic identity. One is at the global level, Iran is arguing that we are seeing the rise of the East, mostly meaning China, and the decline of the West. So they are promoting that idea, that worldview. The world order for them is a post-Western world order, according to the Iranian Foreign Ministry, for instance. So that's one issue. To go along with this trend or reality in their view, they have developed what is called the turn or the pivot to the east. So globally, Iran is looking eastward, mostly to China. But the important point is it's not only China, there's also India. So Iran, in order to solidify its role or its desired role as a civilizational and economic crossroads, is at the intersection of, or placing itself at the intersection of all these geoeconomic initiatives, such as the BRI, which is the most important one for Iran, but not the only one. And then you have the initiative that is driven by India, Iran, and Russia, the international north-south transport corridor. Then you have the initiative between Iran and Central Asian actors called the Ashgabat Agreement, which is for landlocked Central Asian countries to have access to international waters via Iranian landmass. Then you have the Eurasian Economic Union, which has a preferential trade agreement with Iran that is driven by Russia, of course, to solidify the Russian influence in the former Soviet geography. And Iran has a relationship with that preferential trade agreement and hoping to become a full member in the next couple of years. So they're actively trying to basically be part of whatever that is important in terms of geoeconomics in the larger supercontinent of Eurasia, a little bit similar to the role that Turkey wants to play for itself in terms of its geographic identity, the role of a link or a crossroads.
Crossroad, yeah. Okay. And how is China maneuvering between all those other solicitors, so to speak?
China is not opposed to the idea of working with the other partners. For instance, in the case of Chabahar Port, which is the place where India is investing to compete with the port of Gwadar in Pakistan, which is where China is investing. China proposed to, and this was one of the interesting findings that I had, and it was surprising a little bit, but understandable from an Indian worldview. China proposed to Iran and India that it can co-invest with Iran and India in that port, but the Indians fully rejected the idea and threatened to pull away all their investments if Iran agrees with the idea of China joining. So China does not see it, at least so far, in terms of its relationship with India as a zero-sum game, but India is more geopolitically oriented in terms of its thinking, because India, again, the question of Iran has to connect with all sorts of big global questions. India sees the BRI as some sort of, among other things, a containment strategy by China and indirectly Pakistan against India. Mm-hmm. So to offset what they perceive as a containment strategy by China. They are investing in Iran, in the port of Chabahar, to have access to Asian and then European and Russian landmass. So they didn't want they didn't want to have anything to do with the Chinese in that port, because they thought of further investing in that port, the port of Chabahar, as a competition against the port of Gwadar in Pakistan, which is the poster child of the China-Pakistan economic corridor.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks for this very nice explanation. One question. Today is the 8th day of the Biden administration. Yeah. Now, one of the things that they would change as soon as possible was, of course, the boycott to Iran, the sanctions. What will the impact be for Iran? I mean, is that something that they will do, that they would like to cash in on very soon, or will they take a more wait-and-see stance?
There is a potential promise, but it will remain potential, I would say, for the time being, because on the one hand, you have America with all sorts of national urgent issues, if not emergencies, on its plate. The Biden administration has to deal with the pandemic situation, with the China question, with the Russia question, so a bunch of urgent questions that they have to deal with. On the plus side of life, there is basically the same team or members of the same team from the Obama administration that came up or negotiated the nuclear deal with Iran. Now they are in power, and they are potentially thinking along the same lines. That is diplomacy with Iran, multilateral diplomacy. On the other hand, in the case of Iran, the positive news is that the Iranians, this administration is very willing. Of course, this is the same administration that signed the nuclear deal with the Obama administration. The potentially not so good news is that in a few months, Iran will have an election in which it is very likely that the conservatives will win, which will make things a bit more complicated, not impossible, because the same conservatives approved of the previous nuclear deal, or at least they greenlit the nuclear deal. But it's obviously it's easier to work with the reformists. It's a mixed bag.
Thanks very much. Thank you very much. And now we'll turn to Asia, and directly, or though it was pre-recorded, to our colleague Cheng Chui Quick from the National University of Malaysia. I'll come to his role back later also when I interview Matt. Cheng Chui has been studying the BRI since its very beginning, 2013, and he has been looking at 10 different countries in Asia. And we asked him to tell us something about the general patterns that he sees emerging after 7 years BRI in Asia. So the floor is to Cheng Chui.
We can make a few observations about Southeast Asia's interactions with China's Belt and Road Initiative. I would just highlight 3 points that I thought are important. First point is that Belt and Road Initiative is not just about big power push. It can be about smaller states pulls as well, in the sense that smaller countries, despite the disadvantaged positions when faced with China, can actually have agency, meaning that we can be have some active reactions and also even passive, but still preserve our autonomy. So small state agency can also, in addition to proactive initiation, active participation, or active renegotiation, I guess a small state agency can also take the form of passive resistance. So meaning that, for example, we observe from the cases of, say, in Vietnam. So Vietnam actually played some small state agency by saying no to China's proposal. So that's what we mean by passive resistance. So you can deny, you can keep distance, you can actually have the capacity and space to say no. So that's the first point that I thought we can observe quite clearly from Southeast Asian cases when it comes to how smaller countries are reacting to a big and also rising power in our neighborhood, in this case, China. So that's the first point. And my second and also the third point, it's about the external and also the internal reasons that explain why countries in Southeast Asia, as smaller countries, have been playing different forms of agency. Some are proactive, some are passive, some are like active in different ways. So I guess the second point that I will make is that external factors matter, and there is one particular external condition that have a big impact on the whether and to what extent smaller countries can play or demonstrate some agency. And that external condition is the presence, the absence, or to what extent there is an alternative scheme other than Belt and Road. So in this case, I think this is a case that a point that is relevant to EU. For example, 2018, EU has the EU-Asia connectivity strategy. But 2-3 years down the road, we in Southeast Asia and perhaps elsewhere in Asia region, we don't really hear and see much coming up from EU. And something similar can be said about United States. US passed Build Act in 2018, just 1-2 months after EU did the same. But all those EU scheme and also United States arrangement remain as like on paper from the perspective of Southeast Asia. So many countries in Southeast Asia or elsewhere do not think that we have much alternative other than China's Belt and Road. So for those who are desperate for some external assistance to develop infrastructure, they will go to China other than elsewhere. But external conditions play a role. So a Belt and Road initiative or infrastructure development is not just between China and also the host country in the region, but other external actors like EU have a big role to play. So that's my second point. The third and also the final point has to be about the internal conditions, the domestic conditions in the host country. And that I think is the most important factor that determine whether and to what extent smaller countries like those in Southeast Asia can play a role in interacting with China's Belt and Road. So internal conditions such as state-society relations, to what extent the civil society organization of the host country is dynamic enough to constrain or condition decisions made by the leaders or the ruling elites. That's one big domestic factor. But clearly there are other domestic factors, for example, inter-elite competition, right? So for some countries which are more authoritarian rather than democratic, where bottom-up civil society organizations are kind of like passive or near absence. So you can rely on some inter-elite competition, either within the ruling coalition or between the ruling elites and also the opposition elite. So there should be some check and balances. But ultimately, I think, and that's my last point about domestic condition, is that I think sources of legitimation, sources of legitimacy, sources of internal authority is very, very important. Some countries rely primarily on performance legitimation, and some would rely on other identity or nationalist legitimation. And in the cases of, say, Vietnam, and to some extent Philippines before Duterte, you see that nationalist legitimation constrain the impact of performance legitimation. And that also affect the degree to which the ruling elites of the day could and should collaborate with China when it comes to Belt and Road Initiative. It's a kind of complicated situation in which, even though China as a stronger power has a larger space to push the envelope, and this is just human nature. When you are stronger, we have more resources, you tend to push your agenda. So that's to be expected, nothing surprising. And China is not the first and not the last big power to do that. Yeah, but ultimately, infrastructure development takes place in host country, and therefore the government in the host country has a lot of capacity and also space to either push back or to renegotiate or negotiate with China, especially when there are some bottom-up voices. So I do not believe that as smaller countries, we are like passive or powerless. Yeah, even smaller countries have agency, and Southeast Asian cases make it very clearly. It's not all about China dominate the agenda. Smaller countries, weaker countries can always, in one way or another, leverage either the presence of alternative powers like Japan, like other countries, to renegotiate. And I think Indonesia has been doing that fairly well. Thailand similarly also try to leverage on some power balancing to send a signal to China that, we have options. And those are clearly among the lessons that I think we can draw from Southeast Asia. Whether or not we can expect the same dynamic or outcomes in other regions, that remain to be seen again back to the external conditions and also internal conditions. So it's a multiple player dynamics that illustrate the complexity of the issue that we are talking about here.
Okay, thank you, Cheng Chui. I'm not quite sure if you're watching because you promised me you would go to bed early, but maybe you're looking at this, and I hope you're joining us in one way or the other. I'm very happy also that we could have you, albeit pre-recorded, because you're one of the actors that stood at the very basis, at the beginning of this research, because I turn now to Matt Version, who is here at the table, together with Frans Paul van der Putten. I introduce Frans Paul later. But Matt, we happened to be at a conference in Singapore in the fall of 2018. At that particular time, you were doing research for BRI, Chinese investments in Europe, together with Frans Paul. You looked at the railroad project in Serbia and Hungary, connecting the port of Piraeus with the Central European countries. And Cheng Chui at that time was presenting his research on those 10 countries in East Asia. And while we were sitting in this enormous hall, which was the venue of the conference, we were struck by the comparisons between your findings and also Frans Paul findings. You weren't there at that time. You joined us for another Singapore conference later. And what Cheng Chui had come up with at obstacles, opportunities, changing patterns, lessons learned by the Chinese and also by local actors. So that was really remarkable. And then we set out to make a larger global comparative perspective. And now we are here. Now you did actually 2 chapters in the book. One on Latin America, which we will leave aside, and the other one on Vietnam, Cambodia, and Myanmar. And in that you were working together with Cheng Chui for a certain part, and then you divided the countries among yourself, so to speak. He is an American. I mean, that is what Americans usually do historically. Now you heard Cheng Chui. What would your reaction be to the things that he is mentioning, specifically for the 3 countries, Vietnam, Cambodia, and Myanmar?
Well, thanks, Lily. Certainly one of the great opportunities of this project, and going back to the other one we did, was the chance to work with Cheng Chui and also learn from some of these comparative experiences in both China's interaction with its neighbors in Southeast Asia, but also in Europe. As usual, Cheng Chui lays things out very clearly and methodically. I took a little bit of a different angle, although it began with some of the same questions that Cheng Chui was asking. So, for example, in Cambodia, I was asked to give a talk for a local NGO, and they were interested in understanding some of the motivations on the Chinese side of the BRI, but they were also really interested in some of the aspects of China's involvement in Cambodia that didn't really line up with some of the agency that others talk about in the book, and Cheng Chui in particular. So this was not necessarily about big actors, state-owned enterprises that are building ports or railways, but instead a variety of kind of speculative activities, borderline illegal activities that were creating a variety of problems in terms of governance, leading to, for instance, real estate prices going up in the capital in Phnom Penh, but also in Sihanoukville, that there was a kind of concern about what people were associating with Chinese investment, but they were actually at a much lower level of individuals, entrepreneurs, but again, begin sort of crossing the border between legal and illegal kinds of activities, lots of gambling, real estate speculation. And this is what people were concerned about. And the interesting crossover here in terms of agency is this is a very different level of agency. It sort of exposes how agency in and of itself is not necessarily a good or a bad thing. In this case, there's a kind of chaos that comes in the wake of some of these activities. It's unregulated on the Chinese side, it's unregulated on the Cambodian side. I saw some of these activities taking place in Myanmar as well. So this was one of the insights that I had of a sort of different set of actors and a different set of impacts. And the interesting crossover, at least in the case of Cambodia, is that there are these very high-level connections, very close state-to-state connections, including BRI activities, for instance, a special economic zone and a port in the Sihanoukville area. But then that kind of seemed to pave the way for some of these speculative activities. So the real estate development that was taking place, the online gambling activities, all of that sort of flowed in the wake of some of those higher level activities. So this was one of the key parts that I was focusing on, were some of these other, what I call the informal kinds of behaviors, which are a kind of agency, but they sort of shed a different light on it. And then I tried to connect that because this informal economy is something that's huge in China, but because there's so much of a focus on state capitalism and state actors, both in the domestic economy and China's behavior abroad, I wanted to shed a light on some of these other aspects of what we think of as the China model.
Okay, and how about the China model in Vietnam?
In Vietnam, it was certainly a lot of what Chung Chui was saying, a sort of passive rejection of the BRI. Mm-hmm. This was certainly the case. There's very limited Vietnamese acceptance of any kind of investments on the Chinese side that are labeled as the BRI, even if the Chinese side comes and proposes that, say, a railway in the north or the subway in Hanoi or other kinds of big infrastructure investments that are happening are not labeled as BRI deals. On the other hand, Vietnam...
Can they be labeled Chinese? I mean, it's inevitable.
The people I talked to in Vietnam they certainly accepted the fact that this was Chinese investment, but they didn't want to give credibility to the label and prestige that China wanted to name things BRI. But this stands certainly in major contrast to Cambodia and to a certain extent also in Myanmar, which is kind of in between the two. But they also, because there are so many other tensions in that relationship, including in the South China Sea and historically, there wasn't an effort to necessarily reject it outright or say the BRI is bad. So there was a lot of deal making still going on, but it just didn't come with the BRI label. But the other thing that I then did see, and this sort of fit in more with the agency issue, but not necessarily the agency people wanted, there was a lot of Chinese investment in coal-fired power plants. And the Vietnamese government is trying to reduce that for environmental reasons. They want to go with other forms of energy production, but the Chinese, there are various Chinese actors, both official and less official, who are coming in and financing and building coal-fired power plants, sometimes doing corrupt behind the table and under the table deals with Vietnamese actors as well. So this is another kind of agency where you end up getting a lot of Chinese financed and built coal-fired power plants, even though officially that's not supposed to be happening.
I understand. One question that we addressed with Sanne about the French stepping in Ethiopia and the many people courting Iran. How is that in these three countries in Asia? Are there any alternative? For instance, the European connectivity thing. Does that reach out to Cambodia, Vietnam? Myanmar, certainly not, I would say.
I would say the European connectivity strategy, such as it is not on the radar screen in the countries where I was. The major other actor or actors, Japan and the Asian Development Bank, in terms of historical presence in the region, doing infrastructure and other kinds of deal making, also sort of stepping up to compete with China on infrastructure, but also other kinds of investments. If you go, for instance, to Ho Chi Minh City, there was one big project, a big subway line going going in that had a big label on it. It was, Japan-Vietnam cooperation, almost seemingly to highlight that it wasn't Chinese.
Yeah.
So Japan is certainly an actor, Asian Development Bank, but the other one is the United States. Whether that is labeled through some of these new U.S. initiatives, the BUILD Act or the Blue Dot Network, which are more about standards than they are about sort of providing finance necessarily. But the U.S. is a major actor. They're both trying to highlight some of the problematic activities as seen by the Trump administration in those countries, but also trying to highlight U.S. private investors as an alternative. This will be something to watch with the new Biden administration.
Okay, thank you very much for now. I'll turn to Frans Paul, but not after having corrected one of my omissions, is that I forgot to introduce that you're also head of the Global China Research at MERIX in Berlin. Okay, sorry about it.
No
Frans Paul, China coordinator at the LeidenAsiaCentre. Very welcome. We have worked with you before and with Matt on Europe, and then when we started this global comparative, global perspectives comparative. It's a very complicated China book. Then you suddenly voiced interest in going to Indonesia. And Indonesia, of course, is a very remarkable country when it comes to the BRI, because it has been really reluctant to engage. I don't think it's an official signatory to the BRI. It's not?
I'm not sure. That's a good question. No, I have to look into that. Really.
Okay. That's for the next edition.
Yeah.
If this is sold out online, which will be very soon, we'll look into that. Okay, but everybody is aware of the critical posture of Indonesia vis-à-vis China, and especially of its investments. Nevertheless, you went there and you found what?
Yes, well, I became very interested in doing a study on Indonesia, because previously I was doing this same kind of research, but then focusing on Greece, also in relation to the previous project that you mentioned. And while I was doing that work on Greece, I was visiting Indonesia for a conference. And when I was there, I started to note some very interesting differences and similarities. And so I thought Indonesia would be an interesting next case study after my work on Greece to focus on. And also because so my co-author and I, Mirela Petkova, were very much interested in the question, what is the geopolitical significance of BRI? So we were looking for an interesting case study, and Indonesia seemed very relevant as a case study, because the importance of the Southeast Asian region in geopolitical terms, because especially the geopolitical tensions between China and the United States are to a large extent centered in and around that region. And Indonesia, well, obviously is the big country, let's say the informal leader within that region, and therefore the geopolitical significance of Indonesia's position is very high. And we wanted to know whether the Belt and Road related activities that China has in Indonesia are affecting this geopolitical position of Indonesia in the broader context.
And does it?
To our surprise, we found that of course it does to some extent, but the extent is much more limited than we had expected. So the geopolitical significance of the region and of the country is there and is only increasing over time. But Indonesia has been, I would say, remarkably able at preventing to become a part of a geopolitical game of other countries in which it itself has no active role to play. Mm-hmm. This is not the case.
It's making full use of its agency, so to speak.
Yes, so we're talking about agency, of course, today in relation to this book, and in that sense, Indonesia is a very good example. It shows that well, Indonesia is not a small country, but still, in comparison to the US and China, it is a relatively smaller actor. It is very capable at using the limited room that it has to I would say, to a very effective result.
Yeah, a little bit like Iran, in that sense.
Yeah, Iran is also doing similar things in terms of playing different powers against each other, knowing that its role in the region is important. So it plays different actors against each other.
Against each other, yeah. I recall from our last conference in Singapore that there was the then ambassador to Singapore had been the advisor on China for the Chinese president Xi Jinping, and he acknowledged in a public session, so I can easily quote it, he acknowledged that they actually were negotiating with the Chinese in order to get a better deal from the Japanese, and he stood out publicly and said so much. So that was indeed really interesting, and I think for Indonesia it works just like that. So that is, I think, one of the most positive impacts of the BRI, possibly that it enables even small countries like Ethiopia to negotiate better deals. Because one of the things that I recall from an earlier session was said by your colleague Stacey Links, and she mentioned that the need of infrastructure, which is in Asia incredible. I read a figure, I think about 50 billion a year would be needed to meet the requirements that really are needed for good infrastructure. But Africa, of course, is also very much in need of infrastructure. And she mentioned that one of the great mistakes of the colonisatoren. Yes, the colonization. Well, the countries that colonize. What do you call them?
Colonize.
The colonial powers. Yeah, I'm looking for another word, but it escaped me. That the colonial powers had completely overlooked that for the development of Africa, good infrastructure, bringing goods from the landlocked countries to the harbors was necessary. Of course, that is true, but it's also understandable because those countries were divided among the European powers, so they didn't have any real interest in developing another country except for their own country. But it is something that is absolutely true. Now, how much need for infrastructure has Indonesia? And has Indonesia also turned to other powers than China? For instance, the European connectivity strategy. Is that something that appeals to the Indonesian partners?
Indonesia has a huge need for infrastructure development. But there are limits to what extent it can turn to China for this. So you see that the infrastructure projects in which China is involved relate mostly to domestic transport infrastructure, so not international ports, but domestic, like toll roads and high-speed railway, and to energy infrastructure, energy generation. I think that one of the reasons. It's remarkable that in 2013, when Xi Jinping was visiting Indonesia, he actually announced the launch of the maritime dimension of the Belt and Road Initiative, and people, might have expected that, before you know it, Chinese construction companies will be building new ports all over the Indonesian islands, but this has not happened. The involvement by Chinese companies in port development in Indonesia is still very limited, and I think this is because of the political sensitivity of relations with China in general for the domestic audience in Indonesia, and in particular in inviting foreign, great powers to build such critical infrastructure as ports. So there are clear limits to that. And then your other question about the European, what Europe could do. Well, so far Japan is the clear example of being the sort of the countervailing economic power in terms of infrastructure development in Indonesia. And there is no reason why other actors could not also play this role. So yes, the European Union could do this, but then it would have to be able, willing to take risk, and it would have to be willing to actually make money available for Indonesian infrastructure development.
Okay. Should we say anything about debt restructuring in the country or cancellation of debts? That's a big issue, for instance, in Latin America when you look at Venezuela, where it's probably not going to happen. How is the situation? Indonesia is not in need of debt restructuring or renegotiating, I guess, huh? It's not a thing in Indonesia.
Not at that level, no.
No. and in the countries that
I think this is primarily an African phenomenon. In part, it's because of the way this has been negotiated. They're looking at the poorest countries. So this is where the G20 and IMF and others are negotiating this. So most of those countries are in Africa. So even in the case of Venezuela, which China has lent more money to than any other country in the world, it's still considered a middle or high income country, even per capita. So it doesn't fall into these debt negotiations, but then it's bilateral. So yeah, some of the countries in Latin America, Ecuador, Venezuela, fall, certainly there are big concerns about China's lending there, but they don't fall into these broader global discussions were happening. My sense is that most of those are centered in Africa. Maybe Cambodia fits. China certainly has forgiven some loans there, but my sense is the majority of the focus of this discussion is Africa.
Okay, then I turn to Sanne.
Yeah, in Ethiopia it's definitely a topic. Somewhere beginning 2019, it was announced that China cancelled all interest-free loans that were outstanding to Ethiopia until end of 2018. So by now, China, of the total debt that Ethiopia has, 32% is the debt that they have to China.
Okay, good. I see questions popping up, so I think we should turn to the audience because that is what we promise and that's also what we very much evaluate, and we're taking all the questions. I cannot group them because I can only see one or two. And the first is already very problematic because it's addressed to Cheng Chui, and he may be looking at us, but he is not online in any sense. So I really can't. I will mail the question to him, but I think maybe some of you can answer, and I think Matt already referred to a few things. It's about the European connectivity strategy. And Cheng Chui was saying that not much money is going into that particular program, and that is being contested by Susanne Kramer, who said that there's a lot of money available. Money is spent on activities, action and projects via ASEAN and the European Investment Bank. Now, I'm very skeptical about the level of money that is going into these activities. I mean, really into tangible project. Is there anyone around the table who dares to say something on behalf of Cheng Chui?
Well, no, I don't want to speak on behalf of Cheng Chui, but I want to say on behalf of myself that at the moment, the Indonesian government is looking for additional funding, additional partners for an extension of the high-speed railway that it is currently building between Jakarta and Bandung. This is a joint project with China, and there's Chinese funding involved. And so now the Indonesian government wants to improve the economic viability of that railway connection by extending it to other Indonesian cities. So China has already announced that it is willing to step in and to be a partner in that extension project. Japan has already announced that it will not do so. So Indonesia is now looking for alternative partners to bring in together with China. So I think this could be an opportunity perhaps for the EU to do so.
Okay, and is Jakarta aware of this? I mean, is that just your thinking, or do they really look for a possibility to bring in the European partners?
I don't know. I don't know.
Maybe you should tell them.
I will send them an email right away.
Okay. Are there any examples of the Belt Road Initiative working together with the European connectivity? I don't think there are they?
I mean, has anything happened under the rubric of the European connectivity strategy? My sense is there's not even an EU level, like the budget.
Yeah, Susanne Kamerlin is thinking otherwise. Unfortunately, this is just a one-way street, so we cannot communicate. But let me look at the other questions before we turn back to it. Here is a question. It would be great if the panelists could go into the question asked by Susanne Kamerlin. That is what we did, not Cheng Chui, but the other ones. We're rather skeptical about the amount of money going in. Mamad, do you have any clue?
I recently had to write a report for a Brussels-based think tank about China versus Europe in the wider Black Sea region. And in that I had to look for any type of European connectivity strategy funding, not in Indonesia or East Asia, in Central and Eastern Europe. And so far, I couldn't find anything. Maybe there is something that Susanna is aware, but I could not find something tangible. They have had a conference in 2018. There was a conference. It is supposed to be aligned with the Japanese quality infrastructure investment. which I think has good potential for cooperation with the EU to compete and complement Chinese investments. But so far, I would agree with Matt, not much has materialized.
Okay, good. Okay, this is not the last that will be said about it. We should probably come back to it at one point. But for now, I'm going to look at the questions by Doria Moreira. And I think we dealt with it to a certain extent. I'll just quote her. To what extent is the BRI a case of debt trap diplomacy? And how does the book's second main finding, local agents have agency, affect this notion? Now, we have not been looking, other than Venezuela, to countries that are really in a debt trap situation. But you know of these countries, of course. Would you agree that that would be one of the things that is really characteristic for the BRI thing?
Well, I've written about this in the case of Venezuela and China, but also Sri Lanka, along with a Sri Lankan colleague. Yeah. The concept of debt trap diplomacy is an ideological, political one driven by some people in the Trump administration. It's been thoroughly debunked. And when you look more closely at the situation, it's not that there aren't problems, and there aren't problems with agency, including corruption on both sides, and coming up with bad projects that aren't viable in certain situations. It's just that the logic that China set out to entrap its partners by spending or by lending money that they knew couldn't be repaid, and then they could take over the assets, say in the case of Sri Lanka, or to somehow maneuver Venezuela into a position where they were helpless and then take over. This is just not how it's played out. So I think it's been fairly thoroughly debunked at this point. But again, there are some big problems and challenges, the debt sustainability issue, the question of any given project being a good one, a viable one in terms of impact on the environment. If it's an energy project, is it going to go to the places and the people who need it the most? There's many issues involved with the sustainability and viability of projects, but this idea that China's set out to entrap other countries to gain leverage or power seems to not be the truth.
According to you?
Yes, and people can read what I've
they will. But there is somebody who wants to have the floor on this. Mamad.
I like to expand on that. I agree, and also it's not only me, also Deborah Brottigam, the China-Africa expert, agrees that she has called it the meme of the debt trap diplomacy, and it was initiated or started in an Indian think tank, according to Deborah Brottigham's investigations. It kind of negates the whole idea of agency that these countries have, that ultimately, as the video presentation Cheng Chui was talking about, that the infrastructure projects are built in the host countries, and it's the agency of the host countries that is manifested together with the agency of Chinese actors. Also, just anecdotally, I was in the Belt and Road Forum of 2019, and there was a Sri Lankan politician whom I shall not name for privacy reasons, who said that we have around $50 billion of national debt, $10 billion owed to China, $40 billion to Western countries and Japan, and only now people have started talking about Sri Lankan debt trap vis-a-vis China. In reality, it's only 20% of Sri Lankan debt at the time of him speaking, which is 2019, April 2019. It was only 20% owed to China. So I would completely agree that this is an ideologically loaded term, and it kind of denies the agency of the host countries. Okay. Also ignores obvious facts such as 80% of Sri Lankan debt owed to Western and Japanese entities.
Okay. Thank you. Sanne, you want to have the final word on this?
Yeah, I agree with Mats and Mamad. And I would like to advise everyone interested in this topic on the debt trap to indeed read on Deborah Brottigham's research. She is from the Johns Hopkins University. And indeed, it started it was already very politically motivated when it first appeared in this Indian research project. And then a couple of years later, it appeared in a PhD study from an American student. And then it was picked up by US media as scientific research shows that. And from that on, it was copied by media all over the world as a fact, and indeed, that's the reason why she's referring to it as a very successful meme, but there is no evidence so far that the debt trap is
Good.
something
Now,
real.
that then has been solved. Okay, that's very nice, very good. Okay, there is somebody watching from Malaysia, and he or she, Tam Siu Jan, I don't know how to pronounce that, asks, for renegotiations of problematic BRI project, what are some examples of successful renegotiate, and some which failed? Why are some successful and some not successful? Is anybody aware, Matt, are you aware of a successful renegotiated BRI project?
Well, this is definitely Changchui's territory, so I think this is an area that Changchui covers. And I would just, in terms of books that are out there, Changchui has a co-authored book now, Rivers of Iron, which deals with Chinese railway development in Southeast Asia, and that includes, I think, some of these examples. So I would recommend for people who want to learn about that, especially in Southeast Asia, on that. Myanmar is an example. There are a couple of examples. I'm not sure what success is, so this depends on whose perspective we're looking at. There have been a couple of examples. There's a dam example in China in Myanmar, where there was a Chinese invested dam, and the Myanmar government and local community said they didn't want that dam anymore. They're still sort of negotiating it. It's probably not going to happen. But there's another port facility in Myanmar that has indeed been renegotiated, but also with the assistance of American official and other consultants to come in and say, well, is this the type and amount of loan that should be given? And that was renegotiated, but didn't seem to get a lot of pushback on the Chinese side. And in the meantime, the Myanmar side seems to agree that the outcome of this renegotiation leaves everyone better off. But this is, I think, a really important phenomenon of a sort of problem cropping up, whether it's the lending or the environmental issues around it, some assessment of what that problem is, how it can be dealt with better. And this is really a test of the agency that we're talking about, how things get renegotiated and who benefits.
Yeah, okay, good. Thanks for the answer. Thanks for the references. And somebody who's also active giving references on the debunking of the debt trap is our colleague Ruben Gonzalez Vigente, who has two sources, one of them also a Chatham House paper on that, so that really settles the question. Here is a question on the Biden government from Lilian Kranenburg. Is it likely that the US will rejoin the Trans-Pacific Partnership? How could this be possible? How could this possibly affect current relationship between Asian countries and the Chinese actors?
I think the answer is no, not under its current auspices. Biden and others in his team have said that trade and re-entering trade agreements is not going to be the priority. I think that's a signal about TPP or now CPTPP. So I think this will not be at the forefront. On the other hand, I think there's an assessment that the Trump administration took the United States out of the game of negotiating the standards and rules of trade, but on many other issues, and that the U.S. needs to get back into that game along with allies and partners in Asia and in Europe. So part of this is a question of timing. I think there will be some trade components of this. It'll be a bit broader than that. I think from the point of view of our research on this project, maybe a slightly more interesting question will be how the Biden team chooses to engage on these questions of quality infrastructure along with Japan, but also with the European connectivity strategy. So I think there may be more of that activity on standards setting in, say, infrastructure that we should look at.
Yeah. Okay, good. Here's a more general question on the EU reacting to the BRI in general. What has been the reaction so far other than this European connectivity strategy? I mean, there are many European countries who are, of course, signatory to the BRI. But this is really on the EU, so this is Brussels. What would your take be?
At first skeptical.
Yeah.
That it was too broad of an idea and too ambitious, until they saw that there were quite a few large projects actually happening. And then a kind of an offensive reaction of starting their own strategy, I would say.
I don't know, yeah. Yeah. And of course, the reaction of the EU to the BRI has also been a reflection of the general backlash that China encountered over the past few years. I think you can say that. Frans Paul, you want to come in on this?
I think the current position of the European Union is to expand let's say, to renew and further expand the connectivity strategy, but not to. The focus, I don't think, is to engage with China on the BRI, but rather to further develop European Union's own connectivity approach.
Okay, good. Here's a question on the Silk Road, so I turn to Mamad. It's from Leon Verbakel. As China bases its BRI on the idea of the ancient Silk Road and Iran bases new diplomatic and economic ties on the idea of Greater Persia, are other countries involved legitimating economic strategies on such historical ideas as well? Well, I know Turkey for one reason, but Mamad, you see other countries taking on the same ambition?
Yeah, we have to go concept by concept. Like the idea or the concept of Silk Road or New Silk Road is almost universally applied, even in European countries, including the Netherlands, which have not officially endorsed the BRI. The unofficial, informal name of the BRI in many instances is the New Silk Road or New Zijde Route, if I didn't murder the pronunciation. New Silk Road is universally in the Middle East, Central Asia, and that's also part of one interesting twist in the story of New Silk Road is that this is a concept that originated in Central Asia and the Middle East after the collapse of the Soviet Union, not in China, but now everyone associates it with the Chinese BRI, which kind of shows what the Chinese call discourse power of China, so the hegemonic or discursive power of China, that now everyone, including in this country or in Germany, again, countries that are not officially endorsing the BRI associated with it. There's also the idea of West Asia, which is interesting, which I addressed in my chapter, and that's the region distinguishing itself from the idea of the Middle East, which is an originally British concept developed by the British Imperial Office at the beginning of the 20th century, end of the 19th century. So more and more countries, especially when they talk to each other or talk to China, they refer to the region as West Asia. So they want to reclaim their Asian identity because now they see the global situation in terms of the rise of Asia. So they want to be associated as part of Asia. About the idea of Greater or Iran as a link, a similar situation would be Turkey.
Okay. Okay. Another example from Africa?
No, actually not Africa.
Okay, go ahead.
But I think that Europe and Central Asian countries are not using the opportunity enough to show that historically the Silk Road actually for a long time in history had nothing to do with China. It was Central Asia, it were the Sogdians that were completely ruling the Silk Road. And then first the Silk Road went eastwards towards Europe, westwards towards Europe, sorry. And then, so that's about like 2000 before Christ, and then only 200 before Christ, this link with China was made. But we all seem to follow this discourse as if the Silk Road has been a Chinese Silk Road all the time. So I think we are not using this opportunity. And the moment that COVID started in China, I actually made this remark to people I know in Brussels, saying like, this is our moment to actually start a medical Silk Road towards China, and also emphasizing that the Silk Road is something that goes multiple directions. Yeah. And they totally ignored it. And then a couple of months later, China called it the medical Silk Road when they were sending us supplies.
The
missed opportunity.
Yeah, and more recently, they're using the term health Silk Road for the vaccine diplomacy.
Okay.
And,
I think it's a missed opportunity.
Okay, thank you for the addition. I overlooked one question that has to do with the reaction of the EU vis-à-vis China. It's from Meng Meng. Good afternoon, thanks for the interesting presentation. I would like to ask if the EU-China Comprehensive Investment Agreement, the CAI, demonstrates that the EU now is adopting a common stance towards BRI. I mean, it's a remarkable document signed, I think, in December almost during Christmas, when the U.S. administration was démissionnaire, an example followed by a small country in Europe as well. No, that's nonsense. But I mean, people have seen the moment the moment of signing as a very peculiar element of this agreement. Matt, I think in Berlin people are taking this quite serious, the CIA.
Sure, I think all over, but because of the German involvement and Merkel's role in this. But to me, it's not necessarily linked at all to the BRI or to broader EU level or even member country thinking about the BRI per se. It's an investment treaty which has been under negotiation for 7 years, mostly focused on European firms' opportunities for market access in China. So to me, this is like, I mean, the direction of it is different. It's not about Chinese investment necessarily. So to me, the discussion and what we focused on in our chapters is quite different from what the CAI or CAI agreement is about.
Yeah, okay, good. Thank you. I'm looking at my watch because we have to get out here. New people are moving in and we don't want to keep you too long. There is one other question, but it will have to wait. I wanted to ask a question about the CAI because we're having a meeting on that in the Bali on February 15, which you can find on our website. But I think it's time to wrap up, and I will ask Florian to do so right now.
Yes, thank you, Lily. Thank you to all our presenters for this exciting discussion. I just want to say a few things here at the end. I think it's already emerged from this debate that we should be very careful in using ideologically charged frameworks to understand the BRI as if it were sort of one wholesale initiative, and that is quite risky to do so. It doesn't help necessarily as much as the BRI is worth criticizing. There's a lot of things that go wrong to slot it into these understandings of China as a threat or to locate these debates in supposed East versus West dichotomies and so on. That is not particularly useful. So instead, what we've done here, and I think, I hope that you've also found this then a fruitful discussion, and that you'll find this in our pages as well, is to look at the complexities and to assess the situation based on the respective context. And when you do that, once you do that, you see that there are all these different diverse outcomes, and that includes cases where the BRI and its implementation is essentially a foregone conclusion, often for reasons that are to do with interpretations of geopolitics and geoeconomics. Then there are other cases, often wrapped up in discourses about nationalism, where the BRI is almost immediately, and anything related to the BRI immediately rejected. And then you get another set of cases where various actors are trying to negotiate the BRI impact and are recruiting funding from Chinese actors actively. And all of this sort of then provides a tapestry of understandings of how complex this infrastructure initiative is. It's so much more than just an infrastructure initiative, but how impactful this initiative then really is. For the full argument, do please turn to our book. We hope that you will enjoy the open access version and consider then also, maybe if you like the book and want to put it on your shelf too, get yourself a hard copy. But in any case, I want to thank our contributors. They have worked tirelessly on these projects. They were still able to do much of the empirical research just before the crisis broke out. But I think they deserve a particular thank you for then finishing everything up and us getting everything to the printer on time during a very difficult time for many people around the world. So this has been extremely impressive to see them work. And I am, for that, deeply grateful for their collegiality and their follow-through. I also want to thank the colleagues at the Bali for hosting us, and of course, Amsterdam University Press for accompanying us through this publication. And maybe most importantly, a major thanks to our colleagues at the LeidenAsiaCentre, to my colleagues, especially Jonas Lammerting, who's behind the scenes somewhere and tweeting about what's going on and taking care of logistics, and to Lily Schwangers for moderating the session, but also for having handled so much of the logistics of getting this book ready, and probably been bordering somewhat on levels of insanity of having to herd us academic cats along the way. So for that, many, many thanks. And I hope you enjoy the book. And with that, I return back to Lily in Amsterdam.
Thank you very much. Yeah, it has been quite an experience. I thought it took so long for everything to emerge, also because of the corona, people couldn't go, etc., etc. But I've heard from many of the contributors that they have never seen a publication being published so quickly. So for that, I would also like to join Florian in extending our thanks to Saskia Gieling and Jaap Wagenaar from Amsterdam University Press. I would also like to thank the colleagues who are not here, but who also worked just as you very hard. Irma, Ruben, Ingrid, Richard, Stacy, Mike, Joy, and Mirella for making this possible. I once more will show the book, and I will also misuse this opportunity to inform you about our next meeting, which is on February 8 with Bill Hayton from Chatham House, and author of the book The Invention of China. And then we have with Guangxi an online China cafe on February 11, and again on February 15 we will here be in the Bali for a debate on the Comprehensive Agreement on Investments. So the people who had questions on that, and more in general the reaction of Europe towards China, who are interested in that, please join us in the Bali here on February 15. More or less the same time. Now, thank you very much. Thank you all for joining us here today in Amsterdam, and we hope to be able to have meetings in the near future where we can actually see the people who pose questions. Thank you very much indeed.